At 12:59 tomorrow morning, a 50% tariff wall is scheduled to rise between two countries that have called each other allies for more than a century. That is not speculation. That is the deadline President Donald Trump himself set in writing through a formal trade proclamation, and as of this recording, negotiators from Ottawa are still sitting in conference rooms in Washington, trying to make sure that wall never goes up. This is a story about a fight nobody in Ottawa asked for, a prime minister who built his entire career reading economic risk for a living, and an American president who may be discovering that the neighbor he keeps threatening to absorb into the 51st state has other plans entirely. Let's start with who is actually sitting across the table, because that detail matters more than most viewers realize. Mark Carney did not come up through Canadian politics the way most prime ministers do. He spent his career running central banks. He led the Bank of Canada through the 2008 financial crisis, and later became the first non-British person to govern the Bank of England, steering the United Kingdom through the shock of Brexit. That is the resume of a man whose entire professional life has been built around reading risk, pricing uncertainty, and knowing exactly how far a currency, a market, or a negotiating partner can be pushed before something breaks. When Carney took over as Liberal leader and then Prime Minister in the spring of 2025, replacing outgoing leader Justin Trudeau, he inherited a trade war that Trump had already launched. He did not create this fight. He walked directly into it. And Trump did not make it easy. According to Global News, when Carney was sworn in, the United States had already imposed a sweeping 25% tariff on a broad range of Canadian goods, matched by Canadian counter-tariffs worth roughly $30 billion. In his very first speech as Liberal leader, Carney did not soften the moment. He told the room that Canada was dealing with, in his words, a country it could no longer fully trust. And he promised that in trade, the way in hockey, Canada would be ready when someone dropped the gloves. That line traveled fast. It set the tone for everything that followed. Now here is where the background and the fresh developments start to weave together, because you cannot understand what is happening this week without understanding what happened in January. In January of 2026, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, Carney took the stage and delivered a speech titled Principled and Pragmatic Canada's Path. He never said Trump's name. He didn't have to. According to PBS News and multiple outlets covering the summit, Carney condemned the use of economic coercion by large powers against smaller countries, and the room understood exactly who he was talking about. The speech landed. Analysts and diplomats present described it as a moment where Carney effectively upstaged Trump on the world stage without ever raising his voice or naming a target. It was, by most independent accounts, a masterclass in saying everything without saying anything that could be directly quoted back at him in a lawsuit or a press conference. Trump did not let it go. Axios reported that in the days following the speech, Trump rescinded Canada's invitation to a diplomatic initiative he was calling the Board of Peace, related to Gaza negotiations, a move widely read in Ottawa as retaliation for Carney's Davos remarks. The two men then spoke by phone. According to the Associated Press, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent went on Fox News afterward and claimed that Carney had walked back his Davos comments during that call. Carney's response, delivered to reporters as he arrived for a cabinet meeting in the capital, Ottawa, was blunt. He rolled his eyes at the suggestion and said, quote, "To be absolutely clear, and I said this to the president, I meant what I said in Davos. That is not a paraphrase softened for television. That is close to what he told reporters directly, on camera in the nation's capital. This is the pattern that keeps repeating in this relationship. Trump escalates. Carney does not flinch publicly, and often responds with a calm, almost clinical precision that seems to unsettle the exact kind of aggressive negotiating posture Trump usually relies on. It helps to understand why this pattern developed in the first place, because it did not start with Davos. Carney's mandate, according to reporting on his election campaign, was built almost entirely around his ability to stand up to Trump. Before Trump's 51st state comments dominated headlines, conservative leader Pierre Poilievre had been widely expected to win the 2025 election, largely because of dissatisfaction with outgoing Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Wikipedia's own documented timeline of the Davos speech notes that Trump's annexation rhetoric fundamentally reshaped that election, turning what looked like a comfortable conservative victory into a referendum on which leader could actually hold the line against an American president threatening to erase Canadian sovereignty. Trump himself weighed in during the campaign, telling reporters that Poilievre was, in his words, not a MAGA guy, a comment that, rather than helping the conservative leader, was widely interpreted in Canada as further proof of American interference in a Canadian election. Carney won, and the moment he won, he inherited both the trade war and the expectation that he would not back down from it. That expectation has occasionally clashed with the reality of governing. Axios reported that back in October of 2025, Trump abruptly ended trade talks with Canada altogether after a television advertisement aired in Ontario featuring former U.S. President Ronald Reagan criticizing tariffs, a spot Trump viewed as a direct provocation. That episode is a useful reminder that this relationship has broken down and been rebuilt multiple times over the past 18 months, not just drifted steadily toward resolution. Negotiations have stopped, restarted, escalated, and cooled in cycles, and the current push toward the August 19th deadline is simply the latest cycle in a much longer pattern. So let's talk about the 51st state comments, because they are not a one-time joke. This rhetoric has been running since before Carney even became prime minister. CBC News reported that during a phone call on March 28, 2025, while Carney was still Liberal leader, Trump raised the idea of Canada becoming the 51st state. Carney later confirmed this to reporters, saying, quote, "The president says lots of things," while also insisting Trump had shown respect for Canadian sovereignty during the actual substance of the call. Then, in May 2025, at a White House meeting, according to CBC's live coverage of that visit, Trump reiterated the annexation talk during an NBC interview beforehand, telling host Kristen Welker he would, quote, "always talk about that." Carney, standing beside him during their Oval Office meeting, told Trump directly, in French, that repeating the 51st state idea was not useful. The two leaders, according to CBC, ultimately agreed to disagree on the entire premise. By September of 2025, Trump was still at it. Speaking to senior military officials at Marine Corps Base Quantico in Virginia, Trump again floated the idea, reportedly telling an unnamed Canadian official to consider joining the United States and linking the offer to coverage under the developing Golden Dome missile defense system. This is not ancient history. This is roughly 11 months of consistent rhetoric from the American president, aimed at a sovereign G7 nation and its prime minister. Now, why does any of this matter to the tariff deadline sitting on the calendar tomorrow? Because trade negotiations do not happen in a vacuum. They happen inside a relationship, and this relationship has been defined by repeated provocation on one side and repeated disciplined pushback on the other. Understanding that context is what turns tomorrow's deadline from a dry policy story into something much bigger, a test of whether calm technical negotiation can actually outlast political theater. Let's get into the mechanics of the tariffs themselves, because the numbers here are large and they are real. According to multiple reports, including InsideTrade.com, Trump invoked Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930 last month to levy 50% duties on a range of Canadian goods. Reuters and CBC News, reporting from Washington and Ottawa respectively, detail that these 50% tariffs are set to take effect on August 19th, covering sectors including autos, alcohol, and dairy, along with a broader mix of manufactured goods, building materials, electronics, clothing, machinery, and agricultural products. CUSMA.com reported that the White House estimates these tariffs would cover roughly $20 billion worth of goods imported from Canada. And critically, there is no exemption carved out for products that would otherwise qualify for tariff-free treatment under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the trade deal known as CUSMA, that was supposed to guarantee exactly this kind of protection. That last detail is the one that has Canadian officials the most alarmed. CUSMA was negotiated specifically to prevent this scenario, and Trump's proclamation effectively steps around it. These new 50% tariffs would stack directly on top of tariffs that are already in place. The existing Section 232 duties, imposed under a national security justification, are already hitting Canadian steel, aluminum, automobiles, copper, and lumber. On top of that, according to the Canadian government's own trade reporting, the United States began imposing a 10% tariff under Section 301 on most Canadian imports starting July 24, 2026, though goods eligible for CUSMA treatment were, at that point, still exempt. So by the time you stack the existing steel and aluminum duties, the 10% Section 301 tariff, and the threatened 50% Section 338 tariff together, you are looking at some of the most aggressive trade barriers placed on Canadian goods in the modern history of the relationship. The Fortune Report, published in early August, adds a piece of context that is easy to miss in the political noise. It notes that Carney has publicly pointed out that it is not Canadian workers absorbing the direct cost of these tariffs, it is American buyers, since tariffs function as a tax on imports that companies frequently pass along to consumers through higher prices. Fortune's reporting also references a significant spike in aluminum prices tied to the tariff standoff, underscoring that American manufacturers who rely on Canadian aluminum, everything from can producers to automakers, are already feeling upward cost pressure regardless of how the political negotiation resolves. This is the argument Carney has been making publicly and repeatedly. It is not just a defensive talking point. Trump himself has argued the opposite, insisting that the pain created by tariffs will push manufacturing back onto American soil. But according to Fortune's own review of the economic data, there is, quote, little evidence of that actually happening at scale. That is a genuinely contested point between the two governments, and it deserves to be presented as exactly that, contested, rather than settled fact in either direction. Now, let's talk about what Carney has actually been doing at the negotiating table, because this is where the outsmarting narrative either holds up or falls apart. According to Transport Topics and Bloomberg, both reporting on comments Carney made on August 5th, the Prime Minister said Canada is pushing for a trade deal that removes the Section 232 tariffs entirely across, quote, all strategic sectors, specifically citing steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber. Carney told reporters, quote, we have time, we have real negotiations, constructive negotiations on multiple issues, framing Canada's posture as patient rather than desperate. That framing matters. A negotiator who appears desperate gets worse terms. A negotiator who appears to have time gets better ones. Whether or not Canada actually has the economic runway to back up that posture is a separate question, but the negotiating psychology is deliberate. At the same time, Carney has not been purely conciliatory. The Washington Post reported that Carney described the negotiations as having turned, in his own word, nasty, after Trump publicly derided Canada's leadership while simultaneously threatening to expand the tariff list. Carney's response to that characterization, according to Fortune, was pointed. He reportedly told reporters, you can say nasty, but this is a question of Canadian jobs. That is not the language of a leader backing down. That is the language of a leader reframing an insult into a defense of domestic employment in front of cameras in the country's capital, Ottawa. There's also the retaliation question, which is the piece of leverage Canada has been careful to keep visible without necessarily pulling the trigger. Carney has repeatedly stated that Canada could retaliate if Trump proceeds with the new 50% tariffs. U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer has pointed out that Canada and China are, in his words, the only two countries to retaliate against Trump's tariffs so far. Citing restrictions some Canadian provinces have placed on U.S. alcohol sales as a specific irritant. Canadian officials have pushed back on that framing, arguing their countermeasures were direct responses to tariffs the U.S. imposed first, not unprovoked aggression. This back and forth over who started what and who is retaliating against whom is not just political noise. It shapes the entire negotiating dynamic because Section 232 tariffs were originally justified under a national security rationale, and Greer himself has told a U.S. Senate Finance Committee hearing that the country's trade deficit, which hit an eye-popping $1.2 trillion in 2025, according to CBC News, amounts to what he called a, quote, national emergency. That is the language Washington is using to justify the pressure campaign. Ottawa's counterargument is that punishing a close ally and treaty partner with emergency-level tariffs on top of an existing free trade agreement specifically designed to prevent this undermines the very stability that agreement was built to protect. Let's move to what has happened in just the last 2 weeks, because this is where the story gets genuinely current. CBC News reported that Canadian trade negotiators have been focused on discussions covering, quote, all strategic sectors, including the auto industry specifically, as the August 19th deadline closed in. Carney told reporters he was personally, quote, very involved in the Washington talks alongside his negotiating team, a detail that signals just how high stakes Ottawa considers this moment. Former Quebec Premier Jean Charest, who now serves on Carney's advisory committee on Canada-U.S. economic relations, told CBC's Power and Politics that a phone call between Carney and Trump last month resulted in wider engagement from the American side in the most recent rounds of talks. In other words, according to someone with direct visibility into the process, Carney picking up the phone and speaking to Trump personally appears to have moved the negotiations forward, at least procedurally. By August 11th, according to InsideTrade.com, U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer and Canada's minister responsible for U.S. trade, Dominic LeBlanc, met in Washington for what was already their third meeting in 3 weeks. That pace of meetings, 3 sit-downs between top trade officials inside a single 3-week window, tells you how seriously both governments are treating the looming deadline. Qs.com reported that items reportedly on the table included eliminating Canada's retaliatory auto tariffs, lifting provincial restrictions on American alcohol sales, and reworking the structure of Canada's dairy quota system. 3 of the specific irritants Washington has repeatedly cited as justification for its own tariffs. By August 13th, according to Reuters by way of the U.S. Newswire service, and confirmed independently by KFGO Radio's Reuters feed, a Canadian government source said negotiations were, quote, progressing well, and notably added that Washington also wanted an agreement finalized before the August 19th deadline. That source told reporters, quote, they also want to come to an agreement before the deadline of August 19th. This is also their goal. It's not just for us. That is a meaningful shift in tone. It suggests that even inside the Trump administration, there is appetite to avoid letting the deadline actually detonate, which lines up with a pattern seen repeatedly throughout this trade dispute: aggressive public deadlines followed by last-minute negotiated landings. However, IDN financials, drawing on Reuters and CBC News reporting, indicated that as of roughly a week before the deadline, Canada had not yet accepted the latest American offer, viewing the tariff reductions on the table as falling short of Ottawa's expectations. So even with both sides expressing a desire for a deal, the actual substance of what is being offered has, at various points, remained a genuine sticking point rather than a formality waiting to be signed. Then comes the most recent reporting available from just the last 72 hours. The Washington Post, in a piece dated August 15th, reported that the United States and Canada were, quote, inching closer to a deal to avert the imposition of punitive 50% tariffs on Canadian products, citing industry executives and trade specialists tracking the talks closely. Specific products named in that reporting included hockey sticks, wine, and cement, three goods that illustrate just how broad and, frankly, how oddly specific the tariff list has become. And as of August 17th, just one day before this recording, Global News reported that Canadian negotiators remained in Washington through the weekend, describing the effort as a, quote, last-second bid to reach a deal before the Tuesday deadline. That same report noted political friction back home, with Conservative opposition leader Pierre Poilievre publicly insisting that any final agreement must also remove tariffs affecting the softwood lumber industry, a sector that has been under trade pressure for years and was not necessarily part of the current 50% tariff package. That detail matters, because it shows Carney is not just negotiating with Washington, he is simultaneously managing domestic political pressure from an opposition leader who is watching for any opening to characterize a deal as insufficient. So where does that leave us right now, with roughly a day left on the clock? Based on everything verified across Reuters, The Washington Post, CBC News, Bloomberg, and Global News, the honest answer is this: both sides say they want a deal. Both sides have been meeting at an accelerated pace. There are reports of progress on specific irritants like alcohol restrictions, auto tariffs, and dairy quotas. But as of the most recent reporting available, no final agreement had been publicly confirmed, and Canada had previously signaled the offers on the table were not yet sufficient. That is not the same as saying a deal is guaranteed, and it is not the same as saying it will collapse. It is, as of this recording, unresolved. This is exactly the kind of moment where a title promising that Carney has already outsmarted Trump needs to be handled with precision rather than certainty. What can honestly be said is this: Carney's approach, staying personally engaged, framing patience as strategy, avoiding the kind of public capitulation that critics predicted when he first took office, and consistently pointing out that American consumers bear real costs from these tariffs, has, so far, kept Canada in a stronger negotiating position than many analysts expected back when this trade war first escalated in 2025. Whether that translates into an actual favorable deal before the deadline, or whether the 50% tariffs take effect and reshape the relationship anyway, is something we will know within days, not months. Let's also talk about the specific products caught in the middle of this, because tariff disputes can feel abstract until you look at exactly what is being taxed. The Washington Post's list of affected goods, hockey sticks, wine, and cement, is almost darkly fitting for a Canada U. S dispute, touching a sport deeply tied to Canadian identity, an alcohol sector already at the center of provincial retaliation, and a construction material used across both economies. But the fuller list reported by Reuters and CBC extends much further into dairy products, alcoholic beverages more broadly, manufactured goods, building materials, electronics, clothing, machinery, and agricultural products. QZ.com's reporting also notes that certain sectors have been deliberately excluded from the new 50% tariff package, specifically energy, potash, fish, and critical minerals, along with goods already covered under separate existing tariffs. That exclusion list is worth paying attention to, because it tells you something about priorities on the American side. Energy and critical minerals, sectors where the U.S. relies heavily on Canadian supply, and where retaliation would hurt American consumers most directly and immediately, were kept out of the fight, at least for now. That is not an accident. It suggests that even within an aggressive tariff strategy, there are limits Washington has been careful not to cross, likely because the domestic political cost of, say, a spike in gasoline or fertilizer prices would be harder to explain to American voters than a spike in the price of Canadian wine or hockey equipment. It is also worth noting how this dispute is being covered inside Canada itself, because public sentiment there is not uniform. Global News' own coverage from just the past day included reader comments split between frustration at Carney for not moving faster and frustration at critics for attacking a prime minister who, as one commenter put it, is the one actually sitting at the table doing the negotiating while the political opposition is not. That kind of division is normal in any democracy facing a prolonged trade dispute, but it does mean Carney is negotiating with Washington while simultaneously managing skepticism at home, some of it from Canadians who want a harder line, and some from Canadians who worry the current approach is dragging out economic uncertainty longer than necessary. It is worth stepping back to appreciate just how unusual this entire situation is in the context of the US-Canada relationship historically. These are two countries that share the longest international border in the world, a deeply integrated auto manufacturing supply chain that has operated almost like a single system since the 1965 Auto Pact, and a level of daily cross-border trade that, even amid this dispute, remains among the largest bilateral trade flows on the planet. Canada's own State of Trade 2026 report noted that goods trade with the U.S. declined through 2025 due to tariffs and policy uncertainty, but that Canadian exports to non-U.S. markets actually increased over the same period, driven in particular by gold and energy commodities. That is Carney's diversification strategy showing up directly in the trade data, not just in press conferences. And that diversification push is not just rhetorical either. According to Fortune's reporting from late January, Carney has set an explicit national goal to double Canada's non-U.S. exports over the next decade, and has been personally involved in pursuing new trade agreements with India, Australia, and other partners, alongside an existing agreement with China that reduces some previously imposed tariffs. The United States currently absorbs more than 75% of everything Canada exports. Any meaningful shift away from that dependence would represent one of the most significant realignments in Canadian trade policy in generations. Whether Carney can actually execute that vision at scale, or whether it remains more aspiration than achievement, is a question that will take years, not days, to answer honestly. Let's talk about what happens if the deadline passes with no deal, because that scenario carries real, tangible consequences on both sides of the border. Not just in Ottawa, but across American supply chains too. If the 50% tariffs take effect as scheduled, American companies that rely on Canadian dairy, alcohol, and auto parts will likely see immediate cost increases, some of which, based on standard tariff economics and the pattern already observed with the existing steel and aluminum duties, would likely be passed on to American consumers rather than absorbed entirely by importers. On the Canadian side, industries already strained by existing tariffs would face additional pressure. The Canadian Steel Producers Association's president, Catherine Cobden, told CBC News that Canadian steel production had already dropped roughly 30% since Trump first imposed his metals tariffs, a figure that illustrates just how much economic damage has already occurred before this latest 50% threat even takes effect. There is also a political dimension worth naming honestly. Trump's tariff threats, combined with a repeated 51st state rhetoric, have measurably shifted Canadian public sentiment. Fortune reported that the president's threats and statehood suggestions have angered many Canadians, to the point where a noticeable number have canceled planned trips to the United States. That is not a data point about trade policy in the abstract. That is a data point about how ordinary people on both sides of the border are already adjusting their behavior in response to a dispute between two governments. It's worth widening the lens for a moment, because this dispute is not happening in isolation from the rest of Trump's trade agenda. Bloomberg's own coverage of the Canada talks places them inside a much larger pattern the outlet has been tracking under the heading of new levies affecting roughly 60 economies worldwide, alongside a lawsuit reportedly filed by 25 U.S. states challenging aspects of the administration's tariff authority. In other words, Canada is not a uniquely targeted outlier. It is one front in a considerably broader restructuring of American trade policy that has touched partners across multiple continents. That context matters, because it changes how you should read Ottawa's strategy. Carney is not simply trying to win a bilateral argument with one American president. He is trying to position Canada favorably inside a global reshuffling of trade relationships that is affecting dozens of countries simultaneously, some of which have folded quickly under pressure, and some of which, like Canada, have chosen a slower, more resistant path. There's also a broader security backdrop that rarely makes it into the tariff headlines, but shapes how both governments are approaching the table. Trump's push to acquire Greenland, a territory governed by Denmark, strained the wider NATO alliance and put Canada in an unusually delicate position, given that Canada shares a roughly 3,000-kilometer maritime border with Greenland in the Arctic. Axios reported that this Greenland pressure campaign was part of what alarmed Canadian officials heading into the Davos summit, feeding directly into Carney's decision to speak out against economic coercion aimed at smaller nations. So the tariff dispute and the broader Arctic security conversation are not entirely separate stories. They are threads of the same larger tension between Washington's assertiveness under this administration and its neighbors' efforts to defend their own sovereignty, whether that sovereignty is being tested through tariffs, territorial ambitions, or blunt statehood rhetoric. None of that broader context changes the specific narrow facts of tomorrow's deadline, But it does help explain why Carney has been so deliberate about not overreacting to any single provocation. If you are managing a relationship that includes tariff threats, annexation rhetoric, and Arctic security tension all at once, treating every single flashpoint as an emergency would be exhausting, and more importantly, would hand Washington leverage in nearly every conversation. Staying measured, according to people close to the Canadian negotiating team cited by CBC News, appears to be a deliberate strategic choice rather than simple caution. So here is the honest, sourced picture of where this stands, without inflating it into more certainty than the facts currently support. Mark Carney, a former central banker with no prior background in elected politics before 2025, walked into the Prime Minister's office in the middle of an active trade war launched by the President of the United States. Over the past year and a half, he has been publicly threatened with 51st state rhetoric, watched Trump attempt to retaliate diplomatically after a Davos speech that never even mentioned Trump by name, absorbed new rounds of escalating tariffs stacked on top of existing ones, and still managed to keep Canada in ongoing active negotiations that, as of the most recent reporting, both sides describe as progressing toward a possible resolution before a 50% tariff wall goes up. That is a real, verifiable set of facts. Whether it amounts to Carney having definitively outsmarted Trump is something history and the outcome of the next 24 hours in Washington will ultimately have to confirm. Before we close, here's a straightforward account of where this story stands and what remains uncertain. The tariff deadline of August 19th, the existing Section 232 and Section 301 tariffs, the specific meetings between Dominic LeBlanc and Jameson Greer, and Carney's public statements about Canada's negotiating posture are all confirmed through named checkable sources including Reuters, the Associated Press, Bloomberg, CBC News, The Washington Post, Global News, Fortune, and InsideTrade.com. What remains genuinely unresolved as of this recording is whether a final trade deal will actually be signed before the deadline, what its exact terms would be if it is, and whether the 50% tariffs will take effect in full, in part, or not at all. Any claim suggesting a final deal has already been reached should be treated with caution unless it is confirmed by an official government statement from either Ottawa or Washington, since, as of the most recent verified reporting, no such final announcement had been made. There's also a genuinely contested piece of this story worth naming directly. The Trump administration frames its tariffs as a response to a national emergency created by a trade deficit and specific Canadian trade barriers. The Carney government frames the same tariffs as economic coercion applied to a treaty ally in violation of the spirit of an existing free trade agreement. Both of those framings are represented here as exactly what they are, the official positions of two governments in an active dispute, not as an objectively settled matter of fact. So here is the question worth sitting with as this deadline arrives. If a former central banker with no political background can hold his own for 18 months against the kind of pressure campaign that has been aimed at Canada, using patience, quiet resolve, and careful public messaging, instead of matching Trump's escalation move for move, what does that tell us about which negotiating style actually works against this particular American administration? And if the tariffs do take effect tomorrow, despite everything reported here, who do you think actually ends up paying the higher price? American consumers facing higher prices on everyday goods, or Canadian industries already absorbing months of pressure? Drop your take in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of debate where informed opinions on both sides deserve to be heard before the next headline changes the picture entirely. If this kind of grounded source-by-source breakdown of what is actually happening, rather than just the headline version, is useful to you, take 30 seconds right now and subscribe, because stories like this one are still developing in real time, and the outcome could be confirmed within days. If you want to keep the full picture rather than just fragments of it, hit that notification bell, because when Ottawa and Washington do finally confirm what happens with this deadline, we will be breaking down exactly what it means for both economies, not just repeating the press release. And if you found even one fact in this breakdown that you hadn't heard reported elsewhere, do us a favor and share this with someone who has been following the tariff story but hasn't seen the full context laid out this clearly. Because the more people understand what is actually on the table between these two governments, the harder it becomes for either side to spin the outcome after the fact.